On behalf of Walters Kluwer, a very good evening and a warm welcome to our speakers and attendees of this webinar under our Medical Ed series. Our topic today is HIV etiopathogenesis, epidemiology, clinical manifestations and diagnosis. Our speaker today is Dr. Rohit Chawla, who is Professor, Department of Microbiology, Maulana Azad Medical College and Associate Hospitals, New Delhi. He has over 22 research papers published under his credit. He has written books, authored or edited over 5 books. He has an achievement of, he was conferred with President National Board of Examination Gold Medal for academic excellence in the field of clinical microbiology by Dr. Harshvardhan, Honorable Union Minister of Health. He has attended several trainings. He has also a representation on over 12 expert committees and bodies. Also, we will be taking all questions at the end of the webinar, and I request you to please post all your questions in the Q&A panel of this event. We'll try to address all these questions maximum at the end of the session. We'll also provide you valuable feedback via link which we'll post on the chat section of the webinar. Now I begin our session and hand over to Dr. Chawla and request him to please share his screen.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, sir. You are, sir.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Mr. Ravi. Thank you for introducing me. I'd like to thank the whole team of Walters Kluwer for having given me this opportunity to share this dais with all the students who are listening to this series of sessions that you're organizing, the Medical Ed series. So as part of that series, we are having this session on HIV, etiopathogenesis, epidemiology, clinical manifestations, and diagnosis. So as mentioned, Dr. Ravi, we are going to take questions at the end. You can post your questions and I'll address those questions once I'm through with the presentation. So
Thank you, sir.
I'm just going to share my screen.
Sure, sir. Sir, also you can speak a little louder, sir. Your voice is a little slower.
Yeah, sure. Is it better now?
Yeah, this is better now, sir.
Okay, thank you. Now, full presentation mode I'm doing, just let me know.
Perfectly fine, sir. It's good to go, sir.
Fine. So let's make a beginning. As you're aware, HIV as part of the NMC curriculum is a very important competency all across in various disciplines in medicine and obviously in microbiology, which deals with the pathogen itself. So as part of the NMC curriculum, it comes under MI 2.7. That's the competency that we're talking about. And there are cross references to this competency all across in pathology, in dermatology, in medicine, in surgery. So you'll find those cross connections happening as part of the integrated curriculum that NMC has launched. So in this context, most of the aspects which are part of this competency, that is MI 2.7, we are going to cover. So I'm going to talk about the basic virology of the virus, that is HIV, the modes of transmission. Can you see this cursor? Mr. Ravi, is it visible? The cursor that I'm moving?
Sir, yes, sir, we can see that.
Yeah, thank you. So pathogenesis, we are going to talk about the replicative cycle, because replicative cycle has got an important relationship to why the virus causes a lifelong infection once it is established. We'll talk about the natural course of infection. Suppose if you don't take treatment, what happens to an individual? We'll talk a bit about clinical manifestations of HIV/AIDS. And then we'll shift our focus to laboratory methods for diagnosis of HIV infection. And also for monitoring. So there are a set of laboratory investigations available for diagnosis, and there are a set of investigations available for monitoring to see how fast the disease is progressing. And we'll also be discussing a national program in it. So what are the guidelines of a national program, that is National AIDS Control Organization. So whenever the national guidelines are available, it is expected from an undergraduate that they would know the national guidelines for a particular disease if they're available. National guidelines are usually made for disease of public health importance. So you'll find it for tuberculosis, leprosy, and obviously HIV and few other diseases which are of public health importance for our nation. And then finally, I'll touch upon briefly about the treatment, the basics of treatment, the drugs which are available, what are the mechanisms of action. Again, I'll request you to please concentrate on the replicative cycle, because treatment, the points at which it acts actually in various stages of the replicative cycle, we are going to discuss. So you need to make that crucial connection to be able to understand. And what is again a new aspects with regard to the national program, with regard to the treatment we are going to discuss. Okay, most of this presentation I have based on the book that has been edited by myself and Dr. Sumathi that you might be aware of. That is South Asian edition of Lippincott Illustrated Reviews in Microbiology, which is a legacy title which we have adapted painstakingly to make it useful for the students pursuing MBBS, BDS, and nursing in the Indian subcontinent in general, and the India as a country specifically. So I hope you'll find it useful. So let's go on to the business end. We all know HIV belongs to the family Retroviridae. It comes from the word retro, which stands for reverse transcriptase, because the virus contains a very unusual enzyme, which is otherwise not found in nature. There are very few viruses which have this enzyme, and that is reverse transcriptase. One is HIV or retroviruses. The other is hepatitis B virus that you might be aware of. So from these letters, re and tro, we've got retrovirus, got reverse transcriptase. So very easy to remember why it is called as a retrovirus. Please remember, it is not the conventional meaning of the word retro. Retro we mean Purana. So that's not what we are talking about over here. So retrovirus is basically a virus which contains reverse transcriptase, which has got a special enzyme, which is RNA-directed DNA polymerase. That is, it reads the RNA genome and forms a single-stranded DNA copy and then a double-stranded DNA copy. There are 3 subfamilies and 7 genera. I really don't want to load you with these families and genera. We'll just talk about the important stuff. So these Retroviridae is a family, and then we've got 3 subfamilies in it: Oncovirinae, Lentivirinae, and Spumavirinae. Spumavirinae does not have any member which is pathogenic for humans, so I'm going to concentrate only on Oncovirinae and Lentivirinae. Oncovirinae, as the name says, Oncovirinae, it is associated with a virus which is associated with malignancy in humans, which belongs to Delta retrovirus, which contains HTLV1, which stands for human T cell lymphotropic virus 1, which is responsible for adult T cell leukemia or lymphoma, and HTLV1 associated myelopathy, which is also known as tropical spastic paraparesis. So that's a neurological condition. I'm not going to discuss it, just for the completion's sake I'm mentioning. And then main focus of our attention is the subfamily Lentivirinae, to which the genus Lentivirus belongs, to which HIV 1 and 2, the 2 viruses which are associated with HIV AIDS, belong. So the question is asked, HIV belongs to which subfamily or which genus? Your answer would be Lentivirus. Okay, that's a common question that we ask both in your entrance exams as well as in your vivas. And the whole focus of my attention actually throughout this discussion would be on lentivirus, that is HIV 1 and 2, which are responsible for HIV AIDS in the world. Just to give you a context as to how this virus is arranged in terms of its classification. So this is the classification that I'm showing you is not a taxonomical classification. It's kind of a diluted classification where it just gives you a broad idea. So obviously HIV belongs to RNA viruses. We divide RNA viruses into single-stranded and double-stranded. So it is a single-stranded RNA virus, and it is single-stranded RNA viruses, if you all know, are further subdivided into positive-stranded and negative-stranded. The meaning of the word positive and negative strand means if any RNA directly acts as a messenger RNA. In other words, it can be directly translated into a protein. And a negative-stranded RNA virus means it is not directly acting as a messenger RNA. It has to first convert into a positive strand and then it translates. So this is a positive-stranded RNA virus, which is enveloped. It has got an icosahedral symmetry, and within this we've got Retroviridae family, which we just talked about, and within this we have the subfamily Lentivirinae, and within that lentivirus is the genus, and to which we have HIV virus 1 and 2. In the book we've given this supplementary, this S mark, which means that additional information is given in the book if you want to refer to the book. Now, what's the historical perspective? I commonly get this question from my students, how the HIV came about, how it came on the scene. So there are a lot of theories which are attached to it. Nothing is conclusive, yet it is very interesting. So HIV came on to the scene in 1981, when suddenly there were reports of Kaposi sarcoma, which is a very unusual malignancy otherwise, and Pneumocystis jirovecii pneumonia. Pneumocystis jirovecii was earlier called as Pneumocystis carinii. So now it is called as Pneumocystis jirovecii in homosexual adults in US. And immediately people recognize that this has been caused due to immunodeficiency. And quickly, a name was given to the disease, that is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. That is A for acquired immunodeficiency ID, and then S is syndrome. So in acronym, it is referred to as AIDS. But at this point, we did not know the causative agent. So 1983, 2 years after the discovery of the disease, the virus responsible for the disease was isolated in Paris for the first time. And initially, the name that was given was HTLV3, because by that time, we had known HTLV1 and 2. So obviously, it was given the next number, that is HTLV3. Later on, obviously, it was changed, and we now know it as HIV and then HIV1 and 2. 1985, ELISA test became available for serological diagnosis of HIV. And 1986, we had the current name that we use, that is HIV. These are the two people who were conferred with Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology, Lou Montaner and Barry Senussi, for discovering the causative agent of HIV/AIDS, that is the virus that we currently know, HIV1 and 2. Close to the heels of these two people, Lou Montaner and Barry Senussi, in US, Robert Gallo had also discovered the virus, but he actually discovered it a bit later than these two. He also published his findings, but as you know, Nobel Prize is only given to those people who do something extraordinary, and also for the first time. So obviously he missed out on a Nobel Prize because the other group had published their findings before him. But he also was close on the heels, and eventually he also discovered independently the causative agent. So this was kind of an independent verification. So this is a sad phase because he could not get a Nobel Prize, but that's life for you. Now, what's the basic virology? This is a virus which is roughly about 100 nanometer in diameter. If you see the range, it is about 90 to 120 nanometer. It is enveloped. It has got surface peplomers, that is GP120 and 41, which we'll see shortly in the form of a diagram. And it has got a matrix layer, which is called as P17. Now, just try to understand, GP stands for, it's a short form, it stands for glycoprotein. And 120 and 41 is a molecular weight. So matrix layer is just inside the lipid layer, that is the envelope. It is P17. So P stands for protein. It is a pure protein, and 17 is a molecular weight, 17 kilodaltons. And below it, or within it, is capsid, which is again made up of a protein that you are very well aware of, or you might have heard of, P24 antigen we're going to talk about. So that's the capsid protein. As I was discussing earlier with regard to the classification, this virus is a single-stranded RNA virus with positive sense RNA, and a very unusual feature is that it has got 2 copies of the same RNA. It's got a diploid genome, which is not seen in any other virus other than Riftaviridae. And it has got 3 enzymes which are part and parcel of the structure of the virus, that is reverse transcriptase, protease, and integrase. So that's the basic virology. We'll reinforce it in the form of a diagram. So that's the schematic diagram of HIV. So that's the envelope of the virus. I hope you can see the cursor. These are the surface proteins. It's a mushroom-like structure. The one which is jutting out is GP120. The one which is forming a stalk is GP41. Inside is, you can see this layer. It is a matrix layer, which is made up of P17. Inside the matrix is the core or the capsid area. Core or capsid is made up of P24. And within the core or a capsid, we have the 2 molecules of possible-stranded RNA, which has got various enzymes, reverse transcriptase, protease, and integrase. So that's the basic schematic diagram that you've seen in almost every book. That's the scanning electron micrograph to just give you an idea how the virus size is as opposed to a lymphocyte. So that's basically a macrophage, in fact. On top of it, you can see these tiny red dots. This is the virus, and that big structure is basically a macrophage. So just to give you some sense how the virus looks like in terms of size, it's an actual photograph that I've taken, and that's the cell that it is infecting. So just to give you a visual impression. These are the genes of the virus. There are 2 types of genes, structural genes and non-structural genes. Now you need to understand, what do we mean by structural and a non-structural gene? Any protein which forms the part of the virion, is gene coding for it is called as a structural gene. Any gene product which is not forming the part of the virus, but is involved in the regulation of the replication and other things, is called as a non-structural gene. So the structural genes are 3. That's a question that you get in your entrance exams also. GAG, POL, and ENV. GAG stands for group antigen. So codes for core, that is P24, matrix, that is P17. Pol stands for polymerase. So it is obviously containing the reverse transcriptase, which is a polymerase enzyme, then protease and integrase, and N short form is for envelope. So obviously codes for envelope glycoprotein GP120 and 41. Whole lot of non-structural genes are there which are involved in the regulation of the replication of the virus and other things. So these are 6 non-structural genes of HIV: TAT, NEF, REV, VPU, VIF, and VPR. Just one point which is asked as a question in your entrance exams and also asked in Viva. Instead of VPU in HIV2, we have got VPX. So that's the genetic difference between HIV1 and 2. The rest of the other 5 non-structural genes remains the same. So that's the genetic organization of the virus. GAG, POL, VIF, VPR, VPU, and then N, NEF, TAT, REV. So that's the genetic organization of the virus in the form of a schematic diagram. Now, this is important for us in terms of epidemiology. There are 2 types of HIV viruses, HIV1 and HIV2. HIV1 is further subcategorized into 4 serogroups. These are M, N, O, and P, and they are very easy to remember. Start with M. The next English alphabet after N, M is N, then after N is O, and after O is P. So it's a sequence: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. So very easy. If you remember M, rest is English alphabet sequence, but you need to remember that sequence. Okay. So M stands for major, N stands for new, 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 O stands for outlier, and P stands for the next letter after O. There is no meaning for P. Okay, so because we had to conform to that sequence, we just gave it a letter P. As the name says, group M is the major serogroup, and it is responsible for most of the infections worldwide. So the question is asked, which is the most common serogroup of HIV1 all across the world? It is serogroup M. Serogroup M is further subtyped, and these subtypes are also referred to as clades, C-L-A-D-E. That's how you spell it. So these clades are A to J minus INE. So you will not see I and E. A, B, C, D. There is no E. F, G, H, I, and E. So it is A to K, sorry, minus I and E. So A to K minus I and E. And CRFs that I've just mentioned at the end stands for circulating recombinant forms, or CRFs. These are basically recombinations of different clades together. So it is a mixture of A and B or C or D, is called as a circulating recombinant forms. Sometimes they are formed, especially in an individual who is infected with multiple clades. These circulating recombinant forms are formed. Okay. Now, the most important point that you need to remember is that in India, Indian subcontinent, the most common subtype or clade which is prevalent is C. Whereas in the Western world, we have B. So the question is asked, India, most common subtype or clade of HIV1 is C, which belongs to serogroup M, which belongs to HIV1, which belongs to lentivirus, which belongs to lentivirini subfamily, which belongs to retroviridae family. So that's the whole sequence that you need to really understand and remember. Now, again, this is a very, very important table. What is the difference between HIV1 and 2? There are a lot of qualitative differences between 1 and 2 that you need to remember. HIV1 is found worldwide. Most of the HIV infections which happen in the world are due to HIV1. Very few infections are caused by HIV2. It is mainly prevalent in Western African countries. Probably that was a place where the virus arose, okay, and did not spread that much as compared to HIV. And that's why HIV became worldwide as compared to HIV2. Now, what is a possible origin? HIV1 possibly arose from SIV. SIV stands for simian immunodeficiency virus of chimpanzee, whereas HIV2 arose from simian immunodeficiency virus of another non-human primate, which is called a Sooty Mangabe. Serogroups I've mentioned A to K minus I and E, whereas HIV2 serogroups are A to H. Now, if you talk about heterosexual transmission, the rate of transmission of HIV2 is much, much lower as compared to HIV1. So it is less efficiently transmitted by heterosexual route. Again, with regard to the perinatal transmission, the risk of perinatal transmission in HIV is about 30%. We'll discuss it down the line, whereas it is much lower in HIV2. Time to develop AIDS, if you don't give any treatment, how long does a person take to develop AIDS? In HIV1, it is about 10 years, median time period for development of AIDS, whereas it is about up to 25 years. So there is a slow progression of HIV2. It is less efficient in transmission, mainly found in West Africa. Possible origin is a different non-human primate from HIV1. So this actually gives you in a glance the difference between HIV 1 and 2. So the question is asked, which is the most common cause of HIV infection in the world? Without doubt, it is HIV 1. Which is the most severe cause of HIV infection out of the two, HIV 1 and 2? Again, the answer is HIV 1. So HIV 1 is most common also and more severe also out of the two. So please remember these facts, because when I ask these questions from undergraduates, they tend to say HIV 2 is more severe. So please remember this table. It will solve a lot of questions as far as your Viva theory as well as your entrance exams are concerned, NEET entrance exams are concerned. So just to show you diagrammatically, the green one is prevalent most commonly in India and the Eastern African countries. Probably that was a route from East Africa. It came to India, whereas in much of the Western world, you find B, the blue areas, okay, which are more prevalent. Now, this is an extremely important table. Now, if you ask me the most important table for this discussion on HIV is this. If you understand this table, many of your problems will be solved. Now, what are the routes of transmission and what is the risk of that route? And then what is the percentage contribution of that route in the total HIV infection? So these are two different things. Okay. So if you talk about sexual route, the HIV infection is transmitted both sexually and homosexually as well as heterosexually. The risk of transmission by heterosexual route is about 0.1%. Now, what do you mean by 0.1%? If somebody has got sexual contact, heterosexual contact with a known HIV positive person 1,000 times, 1 out of that 1,000, that person will get infected. It is a pure statistic. For homosexual, it is 1%. So if you've got a person has got homosexual contact with a known HIV person 100 times, 1 out of that 100, the person will get infected. But this heterosexual route and homosexual route contributes about 89% of all HIV infections. So if you further split it up, heterosexual route accounts for about 86% of all HIV infections, and about 3% infections are caused by or through homosexual route. So if the question is asked, which is the most common route of transmission of HIV infection in the world, including India, it has to be heterosexual route. But the risk per act is only 0.1%. Okay, so try to understand this concept. Perinatal transmission, again, we'll apply the same logic. It's about 20 to 40%. So if there are 100 mothers who are HIV positive, they each deliver one baby, each of them. The risk, and you don't do any intervention, 30 out of those 100 mothers will transmit the infection to their baby. So even if you don't do anything, 30 babies will get infected only and 70 will not be infected. Okay. But if you do an intervention, you can make it almost zero. Okay. So that's why we've got prevention of parent to child transmission program within our national AIDS control program. Percentage contribution, 6% of all HIV infections in the world, in our country happen in babies. This is from mother to the baby. Blood transfusion. If somebody is transfused with HIV positive blood, known HIV positive blood, it's almost 100% chance that the person will get infected. But how much does it contribute to the total load of HIV infection? Just 1%, which is very easy to understand because everybody is not transfused with blood. So known HIV positive blood, it's almost 100%, and contribution is just 1% because we've got also a screening of blood, which further lowers the risk. And obviously, everybody is not transfused with blood. So if the question is asked, what is the most risky of all the routes? Your answer would be blood transfusion. Okay. Intravenous drug users are a special population which share needles and paraphernalia for injecting drugs between their group. So contaminated needles and syringes are there. So risk is 0.6%, meaning 6 out of 1,000 acts of using contaminated syringe and needle for injecting drug. Total contribution is 2%. Needle stick injury, and this is an occupational route. Needle stick injury occurs in doctors and other healthcare workers. You get damaged by a contaminated needle while working in a healthcare setting. So the risk is 0.3%. 0.3% means 1,000 injuries with a known HIV positive blood contaminated needle, 3 times you'll get infected. But when would those 3 times be? You don't know. It could be the first occasion itself. So it does not mean that you'll have to wait for 997 injuries and then 998 you will get infected. It's pure statistic. It could be the first. So you will take adequate precautions while handling the sharps in the first instance or 998th instance. Obviously, every time you are handling sharps. I hope you've got this point. Extremely important for us to be able to understand the dynamics of HIV infection and its epidemiology. So if I ask this question at the end of the day, what is the most common route of transmission of HIV infection? Without doubt, it is heterosexual route. Which is the most risky route of transmission of HIV infection? You will say blood transfusion. So I hope this slide is clear. It is a very, very important slide for you. Extremely important slide again. What are the things which do not transmit HIV infection? So casual contact like sharing food, shaking hands, hugging, coughing does not transmit. Feces, saliva, urine, sweat, tears, unless they are not contaminated with blood, will not transmit HIV infection. Donating blood will not make person HIV positive. Sharing toilets, it will not. Sharing swimming pool, it does not. Because virus is very is not a very hardy virus, easily gets destroyed. Very common question I get: insect bite. HIV positive patient is sitting in a clinic, a mosquito bites that person, now bites you. I get so many cases. What will happen to us? Nothing is going to happen. Okay, insect में virus survive ही नहीं करता, thankfully. So nothing is going to happen. Don't worry. Now, what is the global scenario and the Indian scenario with regard to the HIV infection? Globally, the total adult HIV prevalence is 0.7%, which amounts to about 38 million people are currently living with HIV. This is 2019 data. 1.7 million new infections. So 17 lakh new infections of HIV occurred in 2019. And in the year 2019, 6,90,000 people died because of AIDS. Okay. However, the silver lining is that because of our concerted efforts, new HIV infections have been reduced by 40% since 2004. So this is becoming a disease which can be chronically managed. Let's see now the Indian scenario. India is the third largest HIV epidemic is occurring in the world. Most of the epidemic actually is centered around the sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, where prevalence is extremely high. India is third largest because of our population. The adult prevalence is pretty low, if you see, 0.2%. But हमारा population ही इतना बड़ा है that 0.2% translates into 2.1 million people. That is about 21 lakh people are living with HIV because the population is so huge of India. We've got 88,000 new infections in the year 2017 and 69,000 AIDS-related deaths in the year 2017. And we are seeing that there's been a steady decline in new HIV infections. They've been reduced by half since 2001. It's a major achievement of the National AIDS Control Program to bring down the new HIV infections from the rate of 2001 to 2017. It has been virtually half. It's a big achievement, and we should know this achievement of our country. Now let's talk about the pathogenesis. The primary receptor for HIV is CD4. CD4, we all know, stands for cluster of differentiation, and the virus binds to CD4. The part of the virus which binds to CD4 is GP120. CD4 is expressed on two types of cells: helper T cells and macrophages. Okay, so therefore, by rule, the virus infects mainly these two cells, helper T cells and macrophages. Then the virus also uses co-receptors, and these are very common questions now you are getting in high-end exams, particularly on NEET entrance. These are CXCR4 and CCR5. These are chemokine receptors. CXCR4 is expressed on lymphocytes, T helper cells, while CCR5 is expressed on macrophages. So those strains of HIV which use CD4 and CXCR4 are called as X4 strains. And those strains of HIV which use CD4 and then CCR5 are known as R5 strains. So therefore, X4 strains will mainly cause the infection of T helper cells, whereas R5 strains will mainly cause infection of macrophages. Now, please remember the qualitative difference between these two strains. X4 strains, when they infect the T helper cell, they kill it eventually. Whereas R5 strains, when they infect the macrophages, don't kill macrophages. Hence, the question is asked, which virus strain is a transmitting virus from one person to the other person? So the transmitting virus is the one which persists in macrophages, and that is R5. So you get infected with the R5 strain of HIV-1, and gradually over time, many of these R5 convert into X4, and the disease in terms of immunosuppression is caused by X4, but the transmission happens by R5. So these are again high-end questions that you get in your good exams, where if you answer these questions in your entrance exams, you have an edge for clearing these exams. Now, what is the pathogenesis in terms of the disease? Because of the destruction of T helper cells, please remember T helper cells or CD4 positive T lymphocytes are the most important cells of our adaptive immune system. If you ask me a single most important cell of our immune system which coordinates with the development of the immune response, the adaptive immune response, it is a T helper cell. And this virus unfortunately damages that very cell. Okay, so it really hurts. It really hurts where it basically really damages where it really hurts. So T helper cells are the most important cells of our adaptive immune response or acquired immune response. So there's a direct infection of these cells. These cells are destroyed. And apart from destruction, there is also a qualitative damage. The cell becomes unresponsive. So that cell also is useless. So because of both qualitative and quantitative damage, over time you become immunosuppressed and you become susceptible to opportunistic infections and malignancies. So that's in a just the viral replicative cycle. Virus infects. The part of the virus which binds to the host cell is GP120, which interacts with CD4, and then because of GP41, the fusion occurs between the virus envelope and the cell membrane. The nucleocapsid enters. The nucleocapsid releases its RNA. This RNA, along with reverse transcriptase enzyme, creates single-stranded viral DNA, which then forms a double-stranded DNA, which integrates into the host genome. And this is called as provirus. Integrated HIV double-stranded DNA is called as provirus. And that's the point where now it's of no return. Once proviral integration occurs, you are infected for life. And that's why we use a term for HIV, once infected, always infected. Okay. Then this proviral DNA codes for the viral proteins and the enzymes. These are then packed together and the viral progeny is released. So one parent virus infects and thousands of viral progenies are released. Eventually that host cell, that is the T lymphocyte, dies in the process or becomes inactivated the process, and you develop immunosuppression. This is a very important, basically a graph which shows you the dynamics of CD4 viral replication and the HIV antibody. And this tells you a lot of important facts with regard to HIV. So when the virus multiplies, this blue line is basically the viremia, virus in the blood. This green line is the CD4 count, and then this magenta line is the HIV antibody. So first I'm going to concentrate on the CD4 and the HIV, and a lot of questions I can answer. When the virus infects the person, you have an acute infection where the virus multiplies unhindered in very large amounts because you don't have an immune response to counteract. When the virus multiplies in huge amounts, the CD4 drops. So you can see a concomitant CD4 drop. And then you develop some sort of an immune response to fight the virus, and the virus therefore goes down. Now, when the virus goes down, you get a rebound of CD4 because the virus replication to some extent has been controlled. But the virus cannot become zero. Okay? Because our immune system is not able to completely kill the virus. Had this virus become zero, I would not be sitting over here teaching you HIV. Because you would have gotten the HIV infection for a few days, you could have recovered from that. And what's the need of studying HIV? It's a mild infection. The precise point is that your immune response is not able to completely kill the virus, and therefore the virus persists at a low level in the form of a latent infection for years together. Slowly it keeps on replicating. Because it keeps on replicating slowly, it keeps on destroying the CD4 cells. So there's a continued fall of CD4 cells for almost 6 to 10 years, even if you don't take any treatment. When the CD4 level falls below 200, you become severely immunosuppressed and the virus breakthrough occurs. Your immune system is no longer there to fight it. The virus breakthrough occurs. The virus further falls precipitously. Now you develop symptoms of AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, in the form of opportunistic infections and malignancies. So if I say HIV and AIDS are synonymous, yes or no? No. AIDS is the final manifestation of HIV infection. So please don't say any person who has got an HIV infection has got AIDS. AIDS is a final manifestation of HIV infection. Okay, so please don't confuse these words, because if you're going to use these words loosely and tell this to a patient may be traumatized. Okay, so you have to explain it properly. And if you give treatment at the right time, we'll discuss that, you can extend the life of that person to virtually the same as an uninfected person. So we manage now HIV as any other chronic condition like diabetes, mellitus, or hypertension. So virtually the lifespan, we've got such good drugs available that the lifespan is just like that of an uninfected person. So let's discuss these phases in more detail. Acute HIV infection, about 50% have symptomatic infection with symptoms of fever, pharyngitis, lymphadenopathy. All these are basically non-specific symptoms. You cannot say that the person is infected with HIV because of these symptoms. And therefore, most of these remain undetected unless you've got a high-risk history. Okay, and gradually, even if they occur, they disappear on their own. Asymptomatic phase, the median duration I was talking about is 10 years. Gradual decline in CD4 cells occurs, roughly about 50 cells per microliter per year. The normal CD4 count is about 1000 cells per microliter. So we've got an average fall about 50 cells per microliter per year. Symptomatic phase, as I said, CD4 cells go below 200 per microliter. And once it goes below 200 per microliter, we call it as AIDS. Okay, there are other AIDS defining criteria also. And now the person develops opportunistic infections and malignancies and dies because of that. HIV does not directly kill a person, beta. HIV makes the person immunosuppressed, and it is the opportunistic infections which kill. Now, what are the various opportunistic infections? We'll divide them into bacterial, viral, fungal, parasitic. The most important, if you talk about bacterial, is Mycobacterium tuberculosis. In fact, it is the most common in India. If the question is asked, what is the most common opportunistic infection which kills an HIV positive person in our country and also in the subcontinent and the developing world, it is without doubt tuberculosis. Tuberculosis hastens the progression of HIV and HIV hastens the progression of TB. It is a deadly duo. दोनों एक दूसरे को synergistic है. So, and tuberculosis is so rampant in our country. So most of the people in our country who are HIV infected develop AIDS actually die of tuberculosis. Other bacterial infections include pneumonias, salmonella infections. Mycobacterium avium causes basically a generalized infection, especially when the count goes below 50 cells per microliter. Okay. Viral infections include CMV. Most of these are reactivations. CMV gets reactivated. Many of us are infected with actually CMV already. It gets reactivated once we become immunosuppressed, and it causes chorioretinitis. And it is the most common cause of blindness in HIV. That's again a PG question that you get. What is the most common cause of hemorrhagic retinitis? Sorry, not chorioretinitis, hemorrhagic retinitis. What is the most common cause of blindness in HIV? Then HSV causes pneumonitis and esophagitis, herpes simplex virus, particularly HSV1. JC virus is a parvovirus, John Cunningham virus. It is responsible for involvement of the brain. Again, it is a reactivation illness, progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy. It is a very severe disease, especially again the CD4 count is less than 50. If this diagnosis is made, the person is virtually on a deathbed. It's not going to recover. Fungal infections include Candida, which can involve esophagus, esophagitis, bronchi, trachea, lungs, and we all know esophageal candidiasis is considered to be an AIDS-defining condition. Cryptococcus neoformans causes meningitis. Again, this is a question: what is the most common cause of meningitis and HIV/AIDS? Is Cryptococcus neoformans. HIV is one subject which teaches you almost whole of microbiology. So it's a very interesting subject in itself. Pneumocystis jirovecii causes recurrent pneumonia. Not very common because prophylaxis is given, especially when the CD4 count is less than 200 cells per microliter. All these are questions you'll get in your exams. Protozoal infections include Cryptosporidium parma, which causes chronic diarrhea that is more than a month of duration. In fact, for months together, you get chronic diarrhea, which is watery diarrhea. Cystoisospora belliae. Cystoisospora belliae was earlier called as Isospora belliae. Again, it causes chronic diarrhea. Toxoplasma gondii, very important question. Again, it is a reactivation illness. It causes encephalitis, which causes basically an encephalitis, especially when the CD4 count is less than 100 cells per microliter. You get this question. Toxoplasma encephalitis is a high risk when the CD4 count goes below what? Pneumocystis, what is the count? Mycobacterium avium, what is the count? So all these are questions you get in the exams. Malignancies, you become susceptible to a whole lot of malignancies. All of these are having viral etiology, like lymphoma. Basically, these are B-cell lymphomas caused by Epstein-Barr virus, that is HHV4. Kaposi sarcoma is caused by human herpes virus 8. Then cervical cancer, we all know, is caused by human papillomavirus 16 and 18 in women. Is basically it's an AIDS-defining condition, especially in women. In fact, only in women, not especially. So this is just to show you the graph at various which CD4 count, what infections are common. Now, just recap now. These are some hard facts that I want everybody of you should know, because otherwise you will not get a full impact of HIV based on our discussion. HIV, please remember, once infected, always infected. Nothing available as of now can remove that infection. You're always infected. Once infected, you're always infectious. Whatever may be the stage, you can pass on the infection. The risk may increase or decrease. In acute infection and in AIDS, risk is high. But in latent infection, because the count of the virus is less, risk is low, but still you are infectious. It has got a long clinical latency of median duration of 10 years if you don't do, even if you don't do anything. Occurrence of opportunistic infections and malignancies is a cardinal feature. No effective vaccine is available. A lot of trials have gone on, but no licensed vaccine is available for prevention of HIV. There is no curative treatment. We have very good treatments available. I'm going to talk about that, but none of them are curative. They can suppress the virus as long as you take, and they are such good treatments that you can prolong the life of the person, as I said, as good as an uninfected person, but you have to take it diligently follow the advice of the doctors, but eventually the virus is going to break through and the person is going to fail therapy. Okay, but you get important years to your life which are relatively symptom free, and the quality of life is good. So please remember these hard facts about HIV. Now, as I was talking about this graph, now I'll concentrate on HIV antibody. So shortly after the person gets infected with HIV, anti-HIV antibodies are formed. And these almost persist almost for the rest of the life of the person. Hence, we use it as a very common marker for diagnosis of HIV infection. So if the question is asked, what is the most common method of diagnosis of HIV infection in our country, in fact, all over the world, it is detection of HIV antibody. Because once it is formed, it is there for the rest of the life of that person. And that's a very marker which can be easily detected to diagnose HIV infection. So various assays are available for detecting HIV antibodies, both against HIV 1 and 2 virus. We've got ELISAs, we've got rapid tests. Different principles of rapid tests are available. Now, what are rapid tests? Rapid tests are those which can be done very easily in the lab or in a peripheral setting, does not require any major equipment, and results are available within 30 minutes. So that's the definition of a rapid test. Various principles are available. I'll just show you the photograph, like immunoconcentration, immunochromatography, particle agglutination, comb-based. And then we've got a high-end serological test, that is Western blot. Western blot also detects the antibody, but it can detect against a particular antigen. So it can tell you whether the antibody is against GP120, 41, P24. That's the advantage. But Western blot is not the primary test that we do, because a lot of inconclusive results we get. The mainstay is ELISAs and rapid tests. In fact, rapid tests are done more commonly as part of our national program, because we want to give the report of the patient same time. We don't want to lose the patient to follow up. If you give the report within 30 minutes to the patient, that patient can be linked to the treatment. Otherwise, if you're going to ask the patient to come later, the patient might be lost to follow up. So that's why the whole focus is on rapid testing in our country. Virological assays where you directly detect the virus are also available, but they're very expensive and they're not very commonly available. But some of these tests are used in our program for some special circumstances, which I'm going to come to. HIV P24 antigen detection can be done by ELISA. Nucleic acid amplification techniques like PCRs are available, where you detect either the RNA of the virus in the plasma or the proviral DNA in the lymphocyte. So two types of PCRs are available. Virus culture. We don't normally do viral culture, but it is possible. These are the ELISA tests. You put 96 tests in one go. We have to do batch testing, so therefore you can't give the report the same day. It is technically more complex and takes a longer period of time. These are the rapid tests. You might have seen these rapid TRIDOT tests, immunochromatographic based tests. These are different principles. Another immunochromatographic. This is a particle agglutination test that is available. And these are comb-based tests. Looks like a comb where you have these dots that you can see visually and tell whether the antibody to HIV-1 is there or not. This is the Western blot I was talking about, where you get the bands. Again, it detects the antibody, but it tells you against which all antigens the antibody is there. And based on the pattern of those antibodies against specific antigens, you can diagnose whether the HIV infection is there or not. Now, what are the NACO strategies? Again, a very, very important question in your exams. If you don't know this, quite simply speaking, you don't know HIV. You have to know these strategies for HIV testing of our country. So NACO strategies, we use up to 3 ELISA rapid tests. And these 3 should either be based on different principles that we just talked about: immunochromatography, then flow through assay, so on and so forth. The first test we do is highly sensitive, and the second and third test should be highly specific. So first test में false negatives कम होने चाहिए, और second और third test में false positives कम होने चाहिए. Sensitive test means false negative come, and specific test means false positive come. Just remember, sensitive में N आता है, so remember false negative. Specific के अंदर P आता है, remember false positive. That's how at least I've remembered. So strategy 1 is for blood transfusion. So you do only one test. If it is positive, you take it as positive. If it is negative, you consider it as negative. If it is positive, you discard that blood and don't transfuse it. So it is for basically for blood safety. This is called as strategy 1. Strategy 2 is for serosurveillance. 2A, sorry. Strategy 2 is further subdivided into 2 categories, 2A and 2B. 2A is basically for serosurveillance. We want to know what is the prevalence of HIV. I mentioned it is 0.2%. So we do a nationwide survey to get to know. In this, we do first test. If it is negative, you take it as negative. If it is positive, you do a second test. If both are positive, you take it as positive. If first is positive and second is negative, you report it as negative. This is only for surveillance. You don't give the report to the patient. So if the question is asked, for surveillance purposes, which strategy of HIV testing for NACO is used? It is strategy 2A. Strategy 2B is meant for diagnosis of HIV infection in symptomatic people. So you do as many as 3 tests. First test negative, you take it as negative because it is highly sensitive test. You take it on face value, the negative result. If it is positive, you do a second one. If both are positive, you report the patient as positive. If the second is negative, you do a third one. So if 2 out of 3 are positive, you take it as indeterminate. I'll tell you what you do with the indeterminate. If 2 are negative, 1 is positive, you take it as negative. And this is meant for symptomatic people, patients developing symptoms of suggestive of HIV/AIDS. Strategy 3 is the most common strategy that we use for diagnosis of HIV infection in asymptomatic people. In strategy 3, same thing is there as strategy 2B, except in the reactive arm, you don't stop at second test being positive. Whatever may be the result of second test, you have to do the third test. If the first and second is positive, you do a third. All 3 are positive, you report it as positive. If 2 are positive and the third is negative, you report it as indeterminate, just like the other limb. Okay, so this is the difference. Your third test you have to do in 2B, you stop at 2. Don't do the third test. But in strategy 3, even if it is second test is positive, do a third one. Now here there is a slight change from strategy 2B. If 2 tests are negative and the first one is positive, if the person belongs to high risk category, you take the history, you consider it as indeterminate. This is a new thing which has happened in national program, and you treat it as indeterminate. If the person is coming from low risk area, then you consider it as negative. So all these strategies are very important set of questions we ask in your theory exams, in your entrance exams, in your viva. You have to know this. Now, what do you do with the indeterminate result? You ask the patient to come after 2 to 4 weeks, and again do the testing, same strategy you apply as you applied earlier, and try to resolve it. If you can't resolve it still, you can do a Western blot or P24 antigen detection or amplification tests. So that's how you resolve the indeterminate results. Now, what are the special situations for diagnosis of HIV infection? Antibody assays cannot be used to diagnose HIV infection in 2 situations. One is acute HIV infection. An acute HIV infection, you've been recently infected, hence antibody may not be present. Antibody takes about 3 weeks to get formed. So you are in a window period. So therefore, if you are acutely infected, antibody test would be falsely negative. The second situation is HIV infection in a baby who's born to an HIV positive mother. That baby less than 18-month old, there may be passive transfer of antibodies from the mother who's infected to the baby through placenta, and they may persist for 18 months, that is 1.5 years of age. Again, in this situation, you can get false positive results. So acute HIV infection, you get false negative results. In a baby born to an HIV positive mother who's less than 18 months of age, you get false positive results. So these situations, you don't do antibody-based tests. So what do you do in acute infection? In acute infection, basically, we do HIV proviral DNA. You detect the viral DNA in the lymphocyte, and that's the evidence of HIV infection. What do you do in case of baby born to an HIV positive mother? Again, you do an HIV proviral DNA in the baby's blood. If you find the proviral DNA, it means the virus is actually there in the blood. Antibodies, remember, are only the indirect evidence. Proviral DNA is a direct evidence, and then you say the baby is infected. Okay. Finally, how do you monitor the HIV infection? Up till now, we were talking about diagnosis. Now, how to monitor? Once you've established the diagnosis, you need to monitor whether the patient is progressing towards AIDS at a faster rate or not. So you do CD4 count or viral load assay. CD4 count measures the CD4 positive cells in the blood, in the whole blood. Normal count is roughly about 1000 cells per microliter, and you measure it by flow cytometry. If the course of infection is fast, there will be a faster fall in CD4. So you do every 6 months CD4, and there is a fall in the CD4 count. You say that the person is progressing faster. If there is maintenance of CD4 at a higher level continuously, it means that immunologically the person is fine. Especially this happens on treatment. Direct virological evidence is by viral load assay. This is different from proviral DNA PCR. In viral load assay, we do detection of the RNA of the virus in plasma. In proviral DNA that I was talking about, we detect the DNA, proviral DNA of the virus in the WBCs, in the T helper cells. Here we detect the free viral RNA, that is free virus in the plasma, again by PCR. We do a reverse transcriptase PCR. And very easy to understand, faster is the course of the disease, higher would be the viral load as we proceed. slower the course of infection, the viral load would be suppressed. It will become undetectable if the person is responding to treatment. So both these parameters actually go in opposite direction. So if the CD4 count falls, the viral load will increase if the person is progressing fast. On the other hand, if the person is responding to treatment and virus is suppressed, your CD4 will rise and your viral load will become undetectable, which is a very good prognostic sign. Okay. Between the two, which is better? If a single question is asked, please remember viral load assay is considered to be the most important investigation for prognostication, even better than CD4 count. Both of them are even better. Okay. But if a single choice is asked, your viral load assay is much better than CD4 count. These questions you get in NEET. Finally, let's talk about some basics of treatment of HIV before I conclude. Large number of antiretroviral drugs are available and they act at different points of viral application that we talked about. Okay. So we've got nucleoside or nucleotide reverse transcriptase inhibitors, which inhibit the reverse transcriptase like abacavir, emtricitabine, lamivudine, tenofovir, zidovudine. We don't use anymore, but it is a representative drug. Then we've got NNRTIs, that is non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors, which includes efavirenz, nevirapine, and we also used to have earlier drug delaverdin, which is no longer available. Then etravirine is now a newer one, which is come. Protease inhibitors. This is basically required for breaking down the polyprotein into individual proteins, and then it is used to make up the virion. So this includes all ending with vir. So emprenavir, ritonavir, sacminavir, so on and so forth. Then fusion inhibitors. Fusion inhibitor binds. This fusion inhibitor basically binds to GP41 and does not allow the fusion of the viral envelope with that of the cell envelope, that is T4 CD4 cell envelope. It is enfuvirtide. Integrase inhibitors are now recently been launched as part of our national program, which does not allow the integration of the proviral DNA into the host DNA. So very common two drugs which we are now using are raltegravir, particularly dolutegravir is being used now in our national program. And then we have got entry inhibitors. Entry inhibitor inhibits the entry of the virus, particularly the macrophage trophic virus, which uses a CCR5. So this basically is a CCR5 inhibitor. There's only one drug available in this category, Maraviroc. Okay, remember the transmitting strain of virus is CCR or R5 strain. Okay, so Maraviroc is based on that strategy. Please remember, fundamental of HIV treatment, you never ever give single drug for treatment of HIV. You give combination, because the resistance in HIV to antiretroviral drugs basically occurs by mutation. And to overcome that, you have to give multiple drugs. Just like we say for tuberculosis, we never give a single drug. Same as for HIV, we never give a single drug. It is in fact a crime to give a single drug for HIV. Okay, we always give multiple drugs, and the usual basically backbone is either two nucleotide or nucleoside and nucleotide reverse transcriptase inhibitors, plus either you add a protease inhibitor or a non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor or an integrase inhibitor. So that's the backbone of two nucleoside or nucleotide reverse transcriptase inhibitors with either protease inhibitor or another non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor or a integrase inhibitor. Finally, we'll talk about the new strategy which is launched by our national program, that is National AIDS Control Program in the year 2017. It is a paradigm shift. This is called as test and treat strategy. Earlier, what we used to do, whenever the CD4 count of the patient used to go below 500, we used to start treatment, we used to wait. Now we don't do this. Since 2017, any person who's diagnosed with HIV infection is started on treatment immediately. What is the benefit? That person can be virally suppressed, and consequently, the suppression leads to better quality of life and longevity. B, because of the viral suppression, the ability of that person to transmit the infection to others is substantially reduced. It virtually becomes zero. So these are the advantages that you get with test and treat strategy. Earlier, आप बोल सकते हो क्यों नहीं शुरू करी? Because in old days, these drugs used to be very expensive, so it was prohibitive to use test and treat. Now, because the drugs have become less expensive and our country is also improved in terms of our per capita income and our GDP, we can afford these drugs, and this has been a paradigm shift. Recently, the UNAIDS has launched this target 90-90-90. You need to know this target. This is a new thing. What is 90-90-90 initiative? It says that you diagnose at least 90% of those people who are infected with HIV should know their status. What is the second 90? Second 90 is those who know their HIV status Out of that, 90% should be put on antiretroviral treatment. Okay, so पहला 90 है, अगर 100 लोग हैं जिनको HIV इन्फेक्शन है, 90 को पता होना चाहिए उनको HIV इन्फेक्शन. Okay, 90 should know. Out of those 90 who know, 90% of those should be put on antiretroviral treatment. They should have access to treatment. Out of those who have access to treatment, 90% should suppress the virus. This is the target that we are now aiming for, 90-90-90 target. I hope you'll understand this. Now, what is India's progress? India being a huge country, still we've been able to make a substantial progress in terms of 90-90-90 target. In 2020 data shows that we have achieved 76% of the people know their HIV status. Out of those 76%, 84% have been started on HIV treatment. Out of those 84%, 84% have been virally suppressed. So we are now on the course of achieving this target. It is a landmark achievement of our national program and something we need to be proud of, because we are not a small country, we are a huge country. To achieve even this is a commendable performance, and we are now going to achieve it in years to come. You'll find that we are going to achieve this target. The first 90 is the most difficult. Rest is easy. To catch those people, to make them realize that they should get themselves tested, is the most difficult thing. Rest automatically takes care of itself. So with this, just some questions I'm going to ask, and then we'll take some questions from you. The most common route of HIV transmission of HIV in India or the world is, anybody? Most common route of transmission we all know is sexual, and within sexual it is the heterosexual route which is the most common route. Second question, which is the most common clade or subtype of HIV which is prevalent in India? We discussed it. In Indian subcontinent it is clade C which is most prevalent. Western world it is B. Of serogroup M, of HIV1, of lentivirinae family of HIV1. Regarding NACO strategy 3 for HIV testing, which of the following is not applicable? Third test should be performed for all the samples. The first test should be of highest sensitivity, and second and third test should be of high specificity. All assays should employ different antigen or principles. If the result is indeterminate, patient should be retested after 2 to 4 weeks. Let's see. Choice B. First test should be high sensitivity, second and third high specificity. Yes. All assays should employ different antigens or different test principles. Yes. You cannot use the same test again as second test or a third test. It has to be either different principle or antigen that we just discussed. If the result is indeterminate, you again repeat the strategy after 2 to 4 weeks and determine the status at that point. Third test is performed in all samples. No, we all know. If the first test is negative, you stop there. You don't perform second and third test. Okay. Only when the first test is positive, you do second and the third test as part of strategy. So answer is A. Very good. Somebody answered it. Which NACO strategy for HIV testing is used for determining HIV seroprevalence? We discussed it. Strategy 1 is used for blood bank safety. Strategy 2 is for seroprevalence studies, that is sentinel surveillance. Strategy 2B is for diagnosis of HIV infection in a symptomatic person. Strategy 3 is meant for diagnosis in an asymptomatic person. So your answer is what? For seroprevalence studies, for sentinel surveillance, it is 2A. Last question, with that we'll finish off. All are true about HIV except it's a spherical enveloped virus, which is about 90 to 120 nanometer in size. We all know it is average size 100 nanometer. Spherical enveloped virus consists of 2 copies of single-stranded positive sense RNA. Positive sense RNA, very unusual virus, has got 2 copies. It has got a diploid genome. We discussed this. Lipoprotein envelope consists of lipid derived from host cell membrane. So when this virus buds out, it takes the host cell membrane along with it, which forms its own envelope on which GP120 and 41 is studied. So this is also correct. The capsid antigen binds to CD4 receptors on the host cell. We all know in an envelope virus, as a general rule, it is the outermost part of the virus which binds to the receptor. So what is the outermost part of the virus in an envelope virus? Not the capsid. It is the GP120 and 41 which is studied onto the envelope. So this is the one, particularly GP120, which interacts with CD4. So what is incorrect? It is choice 4, which is incorrect. So I hope you've been able to gather at least the gist of HIV infection and the basics of treatment, pathogenesis, natural course, so on and so forth that we've just discussed. So thank you very much for your patient listening. So I'm going to unshare and we can take some questions that we have discussed.
Thank you so So, Dr. Chawla, it was a very elaborative session on the topic that you have chosen, and I think there are certainly some questions which are there on the chat section, sir. So, you want me to read out for you?
That would be great because I'm trying to look at the just a minute.
No issue, sir. I can read out some of the questions that we have,
Please,
sir.
please.
Some questions are like, can we please explain 3 NARCO strategy again?
I'll explain. There are 3 basic NACO strategies. And please remember the basic principle of NACO strategy is to detect antibody. First of all, you have to understand this. Okay. Now, there are 3 strategies, 1, 2, and 3. Strategy 1 is meant only for safety of blood bank. Well, I'm going to explain it further. Strategy 2 is further subdivided into 2 categories, 2A and 2B. And strategy 3 is again for diagnosis in asymptomatic person. So one by one, we'll discuss. As many as 3 antibody-based tests are detected based on either different antigens or different principles. I talked about those principles: immunochromatography, immunofiltration, comb-based test, and all those things. ELISA we had talked about. Okay. Now, and we have to use sequentially different assays, either in terms of different antigen or different principles. Now, let's talk about strategy 1. You do only one test. Blood has been donated. I want to know whether I am going to transfuse that blood or not. I do strategy 1. If the first test is positive, I'm going to destroy that blood. If it is negative, because my sensitivity is high, my false negatives would be no. False negative means if the person is HIV positive, my test says it is negative. So that is low. So I'm reasonably assured that the negative test means absence of infection. And that's what I want, safety of blood. So I destroy that blood, don't use it on a patient who requires it. If it is positive, and if it is negative, I transfuse that blood. So I'll just rephrase it. Probably I mentioned it incorrect. If it is positive, you transfuse, we destroy that blood. If it is negative, we are assured that it is negative because of high sensitivity, and we use it for blood banking for transfusion. Positive, destroy it. Strategy 2 is further subdivided into 2A and 2B. 2A is meant for serosurveillance. Now, as I was mentioning earlier, I want to know what is the prevalence of HIV infection. Okay. Now, what will tell me what is the prevalence of HIV infection? Now, why do I want to know the prevalence of HIV infection? Because my allocation of resources as part of our national program will depend on that. How many people are infected, where they are infected. For that, we do serosurveillance, which we also call it as sentinel surveillance. We take out representative samples from the key populations, low risk and high risk, and then calculate, you do the number crunching and calculate what is the prevalence. Now, current prevalence is 0.2%. Now, we've done this calculation based on seroprevalence studies. For this, we do as many as 2 tests. If first test is negative, you take it as negative. If the first test is positive, you do a second test. Now, there are 2 scenarios. Both the 2 tests are positive, you take it as positive. First test is positive and the second is negative, you take it as negative. Here, you are not giving the patient the report. You refer the patient for the correct strategy, but you don't give the report. It is only meant for seroprevalence studies. I hope you've got it. Now we come to strategy 2B. 2B is meant for diagnosis of HIV infection in symptomatic person. That person is having symptoms of HIV. That's why that person has come to you. AIDS-related symptoms. Therefore, you already have an inkling that the person might be HIV infected because of the symptoms. Okay. For this, we do as many as again 3. So let's see. First test, negative, stop over there. High sensitivity, negative test means the person is not having HIV infection. Period. Unless you think the person is having acute infection. That's a separate thing. First test positive, you do a second test. Both the tests positive, you label the person as HIV positive, you don't do the third test. First test positive, second test negative. Here is a situation we now have to do a tiebreaker test. If the first is positive, second is negative, you do a third test. Now there are 2 scenarios in it. First positive, second negative, third positive. Positive, negative, positive. You take the person as indeterminate. Second scenario, first positive, second, third negative. Positive, negative, negative. You take the person as negative. In case of indeterminate, positive, negative, positive, you ask the person to come again after 2 to 4 weeks and you do the same strategy again and get to know what's the status. Because if it is a zero-evolving response, most of these cases will be resolved and you not get a correct response that you will be able to detect. So this is strategy 2B. Now we come to strategy 3. Strategy 3 is meant for diagnosis of infection in asymptomatic people, again by using ELISA rapid test detecting antibodies. Same as 2B. The only difference is that there are certain differences. The only difference is once the 2 tests are positive, you don't stop. You do a 3rd test. Now, what will be the scenario? First positive, second positive, third positive. No prices for guessing. All 3 positive, patient is positive. Second scenario, positive, positive, negative. In such a scenario, indeterminate. Okay, so 2 positive, 1 negative, indeterminate. Ask the patient to come after 2 to 4 weeks, again do the test as per the strategy. The second thing which changes is in case of positive, negative, negative. First is positive, second is negative, and third is also negative. In such a scenario, they've said that if the person is coming from high risk area, suppose a person is a commercial sex worker, is a long distance truck driver, he's got a multiple sex partners. Okay, in these scenarios where you think the risk is high, is a commercial sex worker. In such a scenario, if the person is positive, negative, negative, you take it as indeterminate, ask the person to come again after 2 to 4 weeks, and then again use the same strategy and see whether it resolves or not. So this is in a nutshell about the NACO testing strategies. I hope I've been able to clarify it better than before.
Thank you, sir. So another question is, which body fluids carry no transmissible amounts of HIV?
A very good question. In fact, I'd answered that question when I discussed earlier. Please remember as a golden rule, if the fluid does not have visible blood, it does not have a risk of transmission, especially tear, saliva, sweat. Semen, on the other hand, has got a high risk of transmission. That's an exception. Or vaginal fluid has a high risk of transmission. But in case of saliva, tear, and sweat, no visible blood. Stool, no visible blood, no appreciable risk of transmission. Vomitus, no visible blood, no appreciable risk of transmission.
Okay, sir. There are a few more questions. I'm just coming to them.
Yeah.
Which is,
please shoot questions as many as you can.
Yeah, that's what I've been asking all the our attendees. So he's saying, can you please repeat the difference between structural and non-structural genes?
Yeah.
And examples?
Yeah, I'll explain it again. Now, the name itself contains the answer. If you try to understand structural and non-structural. Structure means that gene codes for a protein which forms a structure of the virion. Okay. Non-structural means that gene codes for a protein which does not form the structure of the virus. However, that gene is transcribed and translated and does some job during viral replication. Okay, so this is what it means. But once that job is over, it does not form the structure of the virus once it is released from the cell. So I talked about 3 structural genes, GAG, POL, and ENV. GAG is a group antigen which codes for P24, that is the core protein, and matrix, that is P17, which forms the structure of the virus. Then we've got POL, which codes for polymerase, that is reverse transcriptase is a polymerase, along with the integrase and protease, which is there within the core. It is always there in the virion, so it's a structural gene coding for it. Then I talked about envelope protein. Envelope protein are GP120 and 41. They are studied onto the surface of the virus. Obviously, it is a part of the structure. On the other hand, there are 6 non-structural genes. They are all involved in the regulation of viral replication during the replicative cycle. That is TAT, REF, NEV, VP, VIF, VPR, VPU. All those I just VIF, which we talked about. They are the proteins are only produced and do their job during the replicative cycle. Once the virus is formed, they are not incorporated in the virion. Their job is done. Hence, because they are not forming part of the virus once it is released, they are called as non-structural genes. In fact, it is a common terminology across the board that we use in all viruses. This is not only used for viruses. It is also used, for example, for HCV. We call it as structural and non-structural genes. I hope it is clear to you now.
Okay, so sir, actually the one question which is persistently asked actually is, how can, maybe definitely for the student level, how can we score more marks in microbiology exam in both theory and practical?
It's a very good question, which does not have any answer. The only answer is be true to yourself, work hard, put in the requisite number of hours. Microbiology is something which has got so many facts. But if you understand the basics behind it, why it is happening, ask this question to yourself, why, and search for it. That will make you understand the basic concepts in microbiology. And once you understand the concepts, you'll remember it. And once you remember it, then only you'll be able to answer these questions, both in theory and practical. So there's no substitute for hard work. Search for the whys. And when you search for the whys, you spend more hours. And when you spend more hours, you remember it, understand the concepts. And obviously that from there flows the answering of questions in both theory, practical, as well as your entrance exams.
Thank you, sir. There's another repeat question that has been asked, which is, can we just repeat about X4 and R5?
Yeah, I'll explain. HIV-1, as I said, are further subdivided into two biological strains. These are called as X4 and R5. Now, X4 strain of HIV-1 uses a receptor which is CD4, that's a primary receptor, and it then uses a co-receptor. The co-receptor that it uses is CXCR4. From CXCR4, you actually take out X4. So CXCR4 is expressed only on T helper cells. So HIV virus, which uses CD4 for primary attachment, and then it uses CXCR4 on the surface of T helper cells because it is only present on T helper cells, will only infect T helper cells. And these are then called as X4 strains. So if I say X4 strain of HIV-1 does what? It selectively infects T helper cells. On the contrary, if a virus, HIV-1 virus uses primary receptor is obviously CD4, and then it uses a co-receptor that is CCR5. It is called as chemokine receptor 5. CCR5 receptor is only present on macrophages. Hence, if an HIV strain uses first CD4 and then CXCR5, that strain of HIV-1 would only infect macrophages. Hence, that strain is called as R5. So you get your questions. These are high-end questions actually, conceptual questions. If the question is asked, X4 strain infects what? You'll say T lymphocytes, T helper cells particularly. R5 strain, you'll say it is macrophage. Now, I told you about the qualitative difference. X4 strains kill the T helper cell. R5 strains don't kill the macrophage. So which strain of the virus will be the transmitting virus? From one human to the other one. The transmitting virus would not be the one which actually kills the T helper cell. Transmitting virus would be one which persists. And obviously the answer is R5. So whenever you get infected with HIV, the initial phases, the strain which predominates is R5. Gradually it converts into X4. At the end of the stage of the disease, when you develop AIDS, it's the X4 which is more than R5. But the transmitting virus is R5. The disease causing virus is X4. I hope it is clear to you.
Okay, sir, there is a question which has been asked repeatedly again, I would say.
Yeah.
I'll just come to that. They are asking, can you please repeat the replicate cycle?
Yeah, I'll repeat the replicative cycle. First of all, you'll have to understand that this virus has got reverse transcriptase enzyme. The virus has got an RNA virus. Now, we all know what is transcription. Transcription is when you read the RNA. When you read the DNA and form RNA, it is called as transcription. Opposite of transcription is called as reverse transcription. So what does that mean? It means that you read the RNA and form DNA. So reverse transcriptase enzyme, once the virus infects, reads the RNA genome of the virus and forms a single-stranded DNA. That single-stranded DNA by the same polymerase reverse transcriptase has got two properties. It has got both RNA-directed RNA polymerase activity as well as DNA-directed DNA polymerase. So एक RNA से single strand complementary DNA बनाएगा, उस complementary DNA से वही enzyme उसका complementary DNA बनाएगा. So from your single-stranded RNA, you get double-stranded DNA, and this is called as a proviral DNA. This proviral DNA integrates into the host genome randomly, and once that integration occurs, you are permanently infected all for the rest of your life. Nothing can remove the virus. So I hope this part of the replicative cycle is clear, and that's why integrase inhibitors come. Integrase inhibitors like dolutegravir inhibit the integration of the proviral DNA into the host genome. So that's the step that it is inhibiting. Once the proviral DNA integrates, this proviral DNA uses the host cellular machinery for transcription and translation now. होस्ट ट्रांसक्रिप्शन मशीनरी को यूज करेगा, एमआरएनए बनाएगा, एमआरएनए से प्रोटीन्स बनाएगा अपने, और उसी प्रोवायरल डीएनए को ट्रांसक्राइब करके आरएनए जीनोम बनाएगा, पैक होगा, प्रोजेनी वेरिएंट्स वुड बी रिलीज्ड फ्रॉम द होस्ट सेल, एंड दैट्स हाउ द replicative cycle would get completed and the virus would be released to infect more host cells.
Sir, I'll just take 2-3 maximum more questions because there are many questions now.
Yeah.
It is just that, sir, the question is like this. I don't know if I'm able to give you a right way of putting it. In the progress of HIV infection, in the AIDS phase, the CD4 cell decrease, but his increases. How does this happen? And now they have less hosts.
Sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah, it says in the progress of HIV infection, in the AIDS phase, the CD4 cell decrease, but it's written, but his increases. Maybe the patient increases.
maybe you can ask the person to type again because I just can't get the
Okay,
message.
so I just request Ms. Sania to just write it again. Meanwhile, we go to some other question, sir, which
Yeah.
is yeah, another question is, if a person gets needle stick injury from unknown source, how to go about for testing and whether post exposure
Yeah, very good. Good
prophylaxis
question.
can be to be
This
taken.
itself is a big topic. Thank you, Mr. Ravi. This itself is a very big topic, post-exposure prophylaxis, but I'll give you the basic gist of it. Now we basically work out how much is the exposure. We call it as an exposure code. And there are three exposure codes, EC1, EC2, and EC3. EC stands for exposure code. EC1 exposure means the exposure, it has occurred on the superficial injuries, the exposure which has occurred is a minimal exposure. EC2 means there has been a percutaneous injury. Percutaneous injury is a superficial injury, or the exposure is occurred on a mucous membrane. Okay, and third, EC3 is an exposure, which means there is a deep injury which has occurred with a hollow bore needle, just like a syringe needle which has gone deep. So if you see, EC1 is least dangerous, EC2 is moderate, and EC3 is serious exposure. We also see the source code. Source code means from whose patient, which patient the blood has come, if the blood is available from the source, whether that blood is HIV positive or negative. If the blood of that source is HIV positive, we call it as SC1 and SC2, source code 1 and 2. Source code 1 means the viral load is less or the CD4 count is high. That is the latent period. Whereas SC2 means the viral load is high, that is early HIV infection or late HIV infection. Based on that, we decide whether the post-exposure prophylaxis has to be given or not. Now, what are the basics of post-exposure prophylaxis? Post-exposure prophylaxis has to be given. Based on this, we decide whether the post-exposure prophylaxis is to be given or not. We have to start it as early as possible after exposure, but not later than 72 hours. It is seen that if you start post-exposure prophylaxis after 72 hours, it has got no value. So you have to start it preferably within 2 hours of exposure, but not later than 72 hours. This post-exposure prophylaxis is a combination of antiretroviral drugs which are taken, and they have to be taken for 28 days. Okay, for it to be effective, continuous 28 days. And in the meanwhile, you do the serial HIV testing on that person. The first HIV testing you do on the day of the exposure. Why? Because we don't want to give the post-exposure prophylaxis to the person who's been exposed, who's already HIV positive for some other reason. If I am HIV positive and now I get exposed occupational exposure, but I'm previously HIV infected, no PP is required because I'm already HIV infected. So you have to document that the person is HIV negative. And then you do serial testing. Serial testing is usually done at 6 weeks, that is 1.5 months, 3 months, 0, 1.5 months, okay, 1.5 months, then 3 months, and then 6 months. So this is the serial testing you do. If at 6 months you are HIV negative, it means you never got infected occupationally, and you can be rest assured. So 0, that is at the time of injury, you get yourself tested for HIV, then 6 weeks, that is 1.5 months, 3 months, and then 6 months you do. Serial testing, all negative up till 6 months, it means that occupational exposure did not cause HIV infection. It's a detailed topic in itself. Maybe for some other day we can discuss in detail about post-exposure prophylaxis.
Sure, sir. Yes, sir. So Ms. Sania has written the question, I think, correct way.
Yeah.
In the progress of HIV infection, in the 8th phase, the CD4 cell decrease, but HIV increases. How does
Yeah.
this happen? And now they have less hosts. If they are using more macrophages, is there any driving force that leads them to do this?
Look, macrophage infection is a persistent infection. The virus is lying over there, low level replication is there, macrophage is not dying. So it will be there persisting. The issue is that the HIV virus, when the exposed strain is there, it is killing CD4 cells. When the CD4 cell goes below a certain level, that is below 200, there is no immune response to counteract it. The virus now grows unhindered and reaches again a peak at the end of it. While low level persistence of the virus, which is a R5 strain, which is still there. Okay, but the transmission does not occur with the, what I'm trying to say is that the level of the virus is very high free virus is very high in the plasma. Okay, and the macrophage, the R5 strain is there. Transmission is mainly occurring through the cellular virus, not the virus which is present in the plasma. It is mainly the cellular virus which is transmitting. This is what I'm trying to say. So transmitting virus is mainly the R5 one. Okay, I hope I've been able to answer the question.
So it's the last question I'm taking just today because it's always like 30 minutes more than we have spent. So why is it so hard to make an HIV vaccine?
Very good question. Excellent question that you've asked. There are a lot of reasons which I've actually mentioned. I'm going to reiterate them and crystallize them over here to make you understand. Number one, once the virus infects, it is a lifelong infection. So proviral DNA integrates into the host genome and there is no drug available that can take it out. So it is once infected, always infected. Have you got it? Once and provirus integration occurs right at the initial stage of infection. So once the established infection is there is no drug available that can take it out. Number one, that's a main reason. Number two, the virus mutates at a very fast rate. The reverse transcriptase enzyme has got a high rate of mutation because it does not have a proofreading capability. So when it forms a copy, a lot of errors are incorporated. And therefore, if you form an antibody against one particular HIV virus, because of the mutations, that antibodies would not work in the subsequent virus because of accumulation of mutations. So that's the second main reason for not having a vaccine. And the third reason is that for a vaccine to work, you need a functional immune system. So if the virus destroys the immune system, you might give the best vaccine in the world. Your immune system is not there to basically develop a protective immune response. So these are three main reasons. Number one, proviral integration. Number two, higher rate of mutation and change in the antigenic structure of the virus. And number three, damage of the very immune system which is required to counteract the virus, which are major hindrances to the development of HIV vaccine. That's why we have not been able to have a vaccine for all these years. So many trials have happened.
Okay, so the general question that I would like to ask you, the general question that as a person got infected, I don't know at which stage of his life, what is the, see at the end, as you said, once infected, always infected. So how many years are there that a person can take it along? Like,
okay, so I actually indirectly answered this question. If you don't take any treatment, if a person is suppose infected today, median time to development of AIDS from the initial point of infection is roughly 10 years. Okay, if you don't do anything, no intervention. But if you take diligently treatment which has been given to you by a treating physician, so good drugs are available, first line, second line regimes are available, which will suppress the virus. The idea is to suppress the virus as much as possible and as long as possible. You can have a virtually same lifespan as an uninfected person, 70 years, 75 years, provided you take the proper treatment and a lifelong treatment. If the first line, obviously after a while, first line will fail. Then you put on a second line regime, then a third line regime. So that actually suppresses the virus for a very prolonged period, so much so that you manage HIV as a chronic condition, just like diabetes or hypertension, and a virtually same lifespan with good quality of life is there in that person.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Chawla. It is a very exhaustive and very, very elaborative session, I must say. In fact, you know, I'm thankful to you that you have taken a time out on this virtual chutti ke din, you know, where we have all celebrating Janmashtami and all. And I still see this. I also thanks my audiences who are still there to learn to know something about this very important topic that we have. And from Wolters Kluwer, you know, we always promise to bring out some more such topics in the future in this medical series now. And thank you so much for everyone, and happy Janmashtami to everybody.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Wolters Kluwer, who've been a wonderful publisher for our book, to develop this concept of Medical Edge series, where we can reach out to the medical students and other health related students, where we can discuss, deliberate on important topics with regard to various medical subjects, including microbiology, and discuss important concepts, not only which are helpful in their theory and practical exams, but also their entrance exam. I hope this session has been useful to you. It has brought about some addition of knowledge on your part. It was really certainly a pleasurable experience for me to take this session with you. I look forward to many more such sessions being organized by Wolters Kluwer for you all. Thank you once again for attending this seminar, this webinar on an online mode, and showing your keen interest in the learning activities pertaining to microbiology. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, sir. Goodbye.